Okay, well, welcome to the Risk Workshop. After 25 years of never using any technology beyond a piece of paper, we're breaking our conventions, our norms tonight with a seemingly very high-tech performance from Steve Keen. One bit of tradition, though, that I will retain is, as usual, I forget the names of all the papers that the speaker has produced, but with a global superstar like Steve, I can be excused for forgetting the papers. And anyway, he's known as Mr. Debunking.
Basically.
And Mr. Debunking here is come here tonight to defend mathematical modelling in economics.
Into the lion's den.
Yeah, which makes me wonder what's going to be debunked. Anyway, with that typical sort of welcome, which is about as good as I can do, I'm afraid, over to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Well, thanks for the invitation, and it's one thing I like that we can do. When there's disagreements within the non-orthodox crowd, dare I call them neoclassical, non-neoclassical, we actually talk to each other about it, which is one of the pleasant things about our side of the debate. It's not a case of wanting homogeneity all the way through. So I'm going to be defending mathematical modelling, but what I'm not, what I'm going to be saying is mathematical modelling in economics as a means of criticism, as a tool of logic, and is what I think it should be, and why I think it's necessary even for people who oppose it. It's unavoidable, which is a conversation I had earlier today with Eliona. What I'm not defending is the modelling that's been done by, and I'm going to use the word neoclassical, despite Tony being here, because he is here, mathematical modelling by neoclassical economists in the main. This is what it has been, and I think why it's damaged economics. But I have a very different perspective on why that mathematics, and in the hands of neoclassical economists, has done damage. And in a nutshell, one of the chapters in my Debunking Economics is titled, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano. That means people, who knows whether the song reference for that, or who doesn't know the song reference for that? Okay, Elton John, one of the songs, one of his famous albums, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player. And my argument is, well, mathematics is the piano, and when you get lousy tunes out of it, you should actually shoot the piano player. Don't shoot the piano. So as a means of criticism, if you look through the literature, and this is something I had to do after I did my undergraduate degree, of course, because you didn't get this stuff covered in the normal textbooks, but you can find an enormous number of fundamental critiques of neoclassical theory, all of which use mathematical logic as an essential part of their critique. So Schrafer was probably the first, the first really advanced technical critique of neoclassical economics. And what he argued was that if you look at how the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, which is an essential part of neoclassical theory, since the days of J.B. Clark, argued that the return to wages, to labour, was a return for the marginal product of labour, and the return to capital was a marginal product of capital. In both cases, arguing an increasing amount of the input would mean a lower rate of return. Now, that meant you had to measure it accurately, and as Schrafer argued, yes, you can measure labour within reasonable bounds. You can measure unskilled labour, you can use multiples for skilled versus unskilled. That's not difficult. But when you add up capital, how do you do that? How do you add, speaking of my technology here, a portable recorder to a laptop computer? How do you add them together? Well, neoclassicals say no problem, they ignore the ontology, let's just add up the numbers we get in the statisticians, and then still use that as an argument for the marginal productivity theory. Schrafer said no, to really add up heterogeneous capital, the best method is to reduce that capital to dated labour. So you say today's capital is yesterday's machinery, plus the work that was done to make it into the machine it is today, and so on. You keep on going back in time and reducing as much as you can the capital component to have a series of terms in dated labour, when the labour was applied to producing something, and then you get a measure. And when you do that, you've got a very complicated expression for the amount of capital you measured, which depended upon the rate of profit, a highly nonlinear function. And that meant that rather than the rate of return of capital, depending on how much capital you measured that you have, the measure you had in the amount of capital actually depended upon the rate of profit. In a way, you simply couldn't reduce to the same relatively simple adding together of workers to work out labour input. So that is a major mathematical critique of neoclassical economics. One you might not have heard of is what's called the dual stability theorem when you look in the literature. It's actually the dual instability theorem. And these the two names are the ones that are most associated with Jorgensen and McManus. I think Blatt does a far better job of explaining it and pointing out its importance in his neglected but I think extremely important book, Dynamic Economic Systems, a Post-Keynesian Approach, written by a professor of applied mathematics, I might add. And that took a look at the stability of general equilibrium. And if you take a look, if you reduce any production function to its various components, the one that determines the stability is the linear component, and that's what gives you an input-output matrix as your very first measure of the structure of any production function. And when you have multiple commodities being used to produce multiple commodities, you get a square matrix where all the terms are either 0 or greater than 0. And according to the Perron-Frobenius theorem, what's called the dominant eigenvalue, the term which tells you whether the matrix as a whole expands space away from equilibrium or contracts it towards, the dominant eigenvalue is greater than 0, which means that, that has a dilemma for neoclassical economics, because when you work out general equilibrium, as they used to call general equilibrium, which is multiple commodities producing multiple outputs and trying to reach an equilibrium price vector, which would therefore mean no change in relative prices, and an equilibrium level of quantities of output, which mean quantities all grow smoothly through time. If you don't have either of those cases applying, you're not in general equilibrium. The matrix determined the dominant eigenvalue for production, so the vector of quantities, but the inverse of that matrix determines the dominant eigenvalue for prices. Now, simple thing about matrices and their inverses, if the dominant eigenvalue of one happens to be 0.01, then the dominant eigenvalue of the other is 100. That means that even if you're working in discrete time, where the important value for that eigenvalue is 1, one of them is going to be massively greater than 1. So necessarily, either the quantity vector or the price vector will be unstable. But they called it the dual stability problem. It's actually a dual instability problem. And that meant that general equilibrium can't be stable. That classic sense of saying a way of reaching an equilibrium price vector and an equilibrium set of quantities, which was Walras's overall aim, was impossible. It couldn't happen. You couldn't have an equilibrium vector of prices and an equilibrium vector of quantities in the same system. The one that I think is most important, one you may know, Sonnenschein-Mantel de Breuer, and that says, let's imagine, or let's pretend you have an entire universe populated by individuals, all of whom have the classic neoclassical downward sloping demand curve. They've all got Hitzian and compensated downward sloping demand curves. What happens when you add them up? Do you get a downward sloping market demand curve? The answer was no. The market demand curve formed by adding up the demands of perfectly neoclassically rational Hicksian compensated demand curve individuals can have any polynomial shape at all. So that says even market supply and demand analysis is not justified. So those are three incredibly powerful critiques of conventional theory. And if there was genuinely a mathematical discipline, the reaction to those three discoveries would first of all have been, well, you can't have a marginal productivity theory of income distribution, because that depends on being able to accurately measure capital and have a nice simple relationship between the amount of capital and the rate of profit. So profit has to be a surplus. You might be able to have wages in some sense reflecting some contribution maybe, but profit's got to be a surplus, which is what the classical theory argued before them. You then have to also abandon methodological individualism, because if you can't reach equilibrium in a well-specified model of production, then prices and quantities have to be set in a non-equilibrium way. So there goes equilibrium. And you have to also abandon methodological individualism, because if you can't even get the market demand curve out of individuals who have all got downward sloping individual demand curves, then you can't even do supply and demand analysis. Now those are very, very strong results.
Can we ask questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What do you mean by a mathematical reaction? You mean a reaction that
if a mathematician had derived those results, the reaction would have been, well, that theory can't work.
Yeah.
We've got to find a replacement theory.
In mathematics?
In mathematics.
That's a mathematical reaction?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask you what you mean by neoclassical?
I mean, derived from the Walras, Jevons and Marshall tradition, which sees methodological individualism as an essential part of how you proceed, which sees individual consumers as being utility maximising individuals, firms being profit maximising, and the belief that you can reach an equilibrium system of prices and quantities out of that system. So I see really it's the Marshall, Wells, and Jevons tradition, which has been transformed numerous times, but in this case I agree with Yanis Varoufakis. Those elements, if you don't have methodological individualism, if you don't have methodological equilibrium, and if you don't have a meritocratic income distribution story as well, then you don't have neoclassical economics anymore.
Okay, I mean, I'm
Okay.
happy to come back, but...
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Now, what's the actual reaction of neoclassicals been? Ignore the lot. They still have a marginal productivity theorem in how they explain, certainly in undergraduate, and also how they think at the level of so-called advanced theory. They still assume equilibrium, though the nature of equilibrium keeps on changing radically. DSG equilibrium is completely different to what was the norm for the computable general equilibrium fad of 30 or 40 years ago, but it's still equilibrium. For instance, CGE to DSGE. We didn't go from CGE to DSDD for dynamics. They're still stuck with the equilibrium belief of how about one must do modelling. And rather than reflecting on the fact that you cannot have individual demand curves leading to market demand curves that are well behaved, the sensible reaction to that theorem was by Alan Kerman in a paper which is titled The Emperor Has No Clothes. Obviously I stole part of that title for the subtitle of my own book. But he argued that what this theorem teaches you is you have to perhaps abandon the idea of starting from the isolated individual. Instead, we have to work at the level of social groups that have some coherent behaviour, which is social classes. In other words, I think the neoclassical agenda, when you look at it seriously, has proven the classicals were right. You have to have social classes, you have to have profit as a surplus, and you have to have dynamics. That's what the proper reaction should be. It's the opposite of what they've done. So I see them as fundamentally anti-mathematical. And what's driving them isn't mathematical logic, it's a set of conclusions they wish to reach. They want to prove that a system of isolated markets can reach equilibrium without any overall coordination. They want to prove that we live in the Pareto best of all possible worlds where merit rules income distribution. They want to prove stability. And rather than finding that out, they actually disproved all that, sometimes own goals. The Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem is a classic own goal, but the other by critics, as in the case of Schraffer and also Blatt. So rather than reflecting upon those findings and changing the nature of economics to suit, they've stuck with those teleological beliefs and ignored the results they don't like. So I see it as an anti-mathematical discipline, not as a mathematical one at all in the genuine sense. Now, I'll just give you an example of that. I'm going to go through one of my contributions, which is much simpler than any of the other theorems, and that relates to the model of competition, which is still taught in all first-year textbooks, and unless we succeed in overthrowing it, it'll continue being taught for the next century. The model they teach in first-year courses is mathematically false. That's the Marshallian model. Not Cournot-Nash is mathematically consistent. There's no errors in the Cournot-Nash proof of perfect competition. It doesn't generalise, that's the problem, and it's too complicated for them to teach as well. But the standard textbook model starts off by saying you have a downward sloping market demand curve, which is already known to be false, but let's start with that particular assumption. So you have the slope of the market demand curve is negative. And then they also assume there's no collusion going on, nor is there any interaction. Firms just simply produce into the market, they don't strategically react to what any other firm does. And the theory asserts that simply because of the number of firms, the firms are price takers. And Mankiw, the way Mankiw puts it, the textbook I most love to hate, and for its way it's dumbed down, a pretty dumb theory to begin with. He says a competitive market has many buyers and sellers trading identical products, and so that, in other words, therefore, each buyer and seller is a price taker, which translates as saying that the demand curve facing the individual firm is horizontal. So you look at the slope of the rate of change of market price with respect to a change in output by a single firm, that's zero. Now, it's a large part of the instruction that all undergraduate students go through, and it was proven to be mathematically false in 1957 by, of all people, George Stigler. You go back and look at George Stigler's paper, which was an invited paper in the Journal of Political Economy. As we all know, that is not political economy as we mean it, one of the most conservative and therefore prestigious journals in the discipline. They invited George to write a historical piece called Perfect Competition Historically Contemplated. And he simply applied the chain rule to say that the firms demand curve is the market's demand curve times how much market output changes given a change in output by a single firm. So you simply do this little piece of simple mathematics. Slope of the market, the individual firm's demand curve is slope of the market demand curve times how much market output changes given a change in output by a single firm. What's the value of that? Well, Stigler's Maths, that's the journal, and this is a particular footnote 31. You take a look at footnote 31, he says that the slope, the change in a market output given a change in output by a single firm is 1, which is basically saying if one firm increases its output and the others don't strategically react, then the market output increases by as much as that firm increases its own output. That's all it's saying. So that means you can then fill out that expression and say that the slope of the market, an individual firm's demand curve is the market demand curve times d big 2 d little q, which is the market demand curve times 1, which is the slope of the market demand curve, which is negative. So the slope of the demand curve facing the individual so-called competitive firm is exactly the same as the slope of the market demand curve. So under Marshallian conditions, there is no such thing as perfect competition. Now, that's not exactly what Stigler wanted to prove, as you can imagine. I think he was trying to be a bit elaborate and clever here, and oh shit, there's a hole in my foot. Can I fix it? Well, he thought he found a way out. And that's where the footnote actually is on about. Because he said as you added more firms to the market, you converged to perfect competition. So he said it's intuitively plausible. That's a phrase I often see by neoclassicals making an outrageously wrong statement. That with infinite number of firms, an infinite number, I like that one too, all monopoly power disappears, and you then get this result. He says a simple demonstration, if sellers of equal size, all you've got to show is this expression is true. And that's saying marginal revenue equals price, plus price divided by the number of sellers multiplied by the market elasticity of demand. Now, this is a mathematically accurate, true statement. And that term goes to 0 as the number of sellers goes to infinity. Quite true. There's only one problem with it. It'd be mathematically correct about what would happen in competition as well if firms set output by equating marginal revenue and marginal cost. Okay? And that's what the theory says they do because they say it's profit maximising behaviour. Only it's not. It's provably not profit maximising behaviour. Let's look at that. They assume it maximises profit. This is what Mankiw says. Profit maximisation occurs. Okay, where these two curves intersect. It doesn't. Because one firm's profit in an industry depends upon what other firms do as well as what it does. That's even if it doesn't know what the other firms are doing, even if there's no collusion, simply because this is a simple mathematical statement. Your profit depends on what other people do as well as what you do. So therefore, the true maximising profit point is not where you solve for this expression being equal to 0, which is the rate of change of your profit with respect to your own output. You solve for Q, where the rate of change of your profit with respect to total market output is 0. That's the true profit maximising point. Now let's see what happens when you work them out. What you find is rather than that being the profit maximising function, which therefore profit maximisers would follow, and therefore you'd get Stigler's convergence, the actual answer is this one. And notice the difference. It's not trivial because n's a big number. The neoclassical formula emits the number of firms in the industry as a multiplier of the second term in the expression. And therefore the neoclassical formula is only correct for monopoly. Let's go through the logic of that. Bit of mathematics coming up here. That's what you're trying to set to 0. That's the rate of change, pardon you can't quite see the d of the differential there, but the rate of change of your profit, the profit of the ith firm, with respect to market quantity, is the sum of the partial derivatives of the change in your profit given a change in output by the jth firm over all the firms in the industry, of whom the ith firm is 1. Let's take a look at this bit. That's saying sum over all firms in the industry. This bit is how much the profit of the ith firm changes given a change in output by the jth firm. And the final bit here is the inverse of what I've just shown as 1 under Marshallian conditions. So you can just say that's 1 and expand this using the product rule. I'm just expanding the revenue part here. So the partial differential of the revenue of the ith firm with respect to changes in output by the jth firm is P times partial Qi partial Qj plus Qi times partial Qjp. and a partial P power to partial Qj. Now, when you do that expansion, that is how much does the output of the ith firm change given a change in output by the jth firm. Because you're sort of talking non-collusive behaviour, n minus 1 times that's 0, but once it's partial Qi, therefore it's 1. So what you get out of that is 1 copy of P. This bit here is change in the costs of the output of the ith firm given a change in output by the jth firm. Again, n minus 1 times that's 0. Once, it's marginal cost of the ith firm. And this bit here, as Stigler has demonstrated, you can substitute the slope of the market demand curve for that expression. So what you get is n copies of Qi out of that. So what you get is the ith firm maximises its profit where 1 copy of market price plus n copies of the output of the ith firm times the slope of the market demand curve minus marginal cost of the ith firm equals 0. That's your true profit maximising formula. And if they're genuinely profit maximisers, that's the output level they'll choose. You rearrange that, that's where you get the marginal cost equal to P plus n times Qi, and that's what's left out of the neoclassical formula, which is wrong, mathematically false. And there's a lot more to it that's in that linked paper there in the Real World Economic Review. So that's been rejected from a number of neoclassical journals, amongst others, published in Review of Real World Economics ultimately. And one of my favourite rejections came from Robert Clower when it was submitted to the Journal of Economics Education. I know it's Robert Clower, he might as well have signed it. There were so many bloody references to his work, it was ridiculous. But in that he said George Stigler's application of differentiation here is contrary to the spirit of Marshallian economics, or something of that nature. I'll just send you a copy, Tony. It's a good laugh. But here's a pretty progressive as they go, neoclassical economist, objecting to the use of calculus in economics. Why? Because it didn't reach the results he wanted. So it pretends to be mathematical. It ignores results when in conflict with the teleology that dominates the theory, and it also ignores empirical facts. And I had to mention this today, given that Fred Lee died tragically young very recently. Fred's work was to point out that the assumption they make of rising marginal cost is empirically false. We have about 150 studies, including most recently Alan Blinder's extremely neglected book asking about prices. And every one of those studies has concluded that minimum 89%, which was the level that Blinder found, but normally 95%, which is the level that Eichner and Guthrie and Means and so on tended to find in their surveys, have constant or declining marginal cost. What do you see in the textbooks? Rising marginal cost. Why don't you see the empirical reality? Because it doesn't suit the theory. This is not a mathematical science. It's mythematics, not mathematics. So, I want to go on now to talking about using it as a tool of logic rather than just criticising the neoclassicals. How might it help build a new economics? Well, there's a lot of disputes in the post-Keynesian and heterodox fields in general which can't be resolved in words alone. And this is an area where people have much more respect for ontology, as I do. Realism is an essential part of how one has to think about modelling the economy. But then you get caught in various logical conundrums. For example, and this is the one that I've been most heavily involved in recently, does a change in private debt play any role in aggregate demand? Now, people have associated with a particular statement I'm going to modify in the course of today's presentation. But I'll start with the empirical data because I'm arguing that, I have always argued that change in demand debt does play a role in aggregate demand. And look at the empirical relationship. You'd think there's got to be something going on here. But that's change in private debt versus unemployment. And the correlation coefficient over there the last 25 years is minus 0.9. Now, I think most of you would know that if you do any correlation work at all, you'd be rather pleased to get a figure that big for anything trivial, let alone something about the relationship of change in private debt to the level of unemployment when you're told that it should have no correlation whatsoever if you follow neoclassical logic. And Bernanke made that case in his essays on the Great Depression. Now, of course, correlation isn't causation, but how do you explain this regularity? This is something which we, for genuine scientists, simply having shown this would be like the black body radiation problem in physics. How the hell do we explain the shape of this curve? Well, my original shorthand was to say that aggregate demand is income plus change in debt. And I got castigated by not just neoclassicals now, but also a lot of post-Keynesians, because this implies expenditure exceeds income, which was a dilemma I was aware of. And I made various attempts at making some sort of temporal arguments, so saying the change in debt comes first and then the change in income, etc., etc. But they went nowhere in terms of persuading staunch critics, persuaded some people, but not others. And for example, there's now the Review of Keynesian Economics, the last edition, the last volume, had a debate where I put my case forward and it was challenged by Mark Lavoie and Brett Feiberger, but agreed with by Tom Pally, but with some qualifications. Now, Mark just wrote that sentence at one point, I will not deal with the correlations. I'm sorry, if we're truly scientific, Mark, he's a good mate, I like Mark a lot. One of these days going to beat you at tennis, mate. You have to investigate stuff that's this outstanding. Correlations like that can't just be rejected on correlation as in causation or, aberrant data, etc., etc. Brett Feiberger made a rather more reasonable statement, and this actually is what provoked me into getting a solution. So unless I can explain how the purchase of good does not provide income for the seller, then I've got to rethink my claim that extensions can force an inequality. Okay? So he's saying expenditure equals income. How can I reconcile that with the argument that a change in debt plays a role in aggregate demand? Well, my response mathematically was, well, can I? This is a good challenge. Can I derive the arguments I've got from the argument that expenditure equals income? So I thought I'd put it into an expenditure table, and maths are essential here because I had to express this. I could have done it logically. It is effectively you could probably call it more logic than mathematics, but it's putting in a mathematical, logical form. So I say expenditure is identical to income in an expenditure table, and then I include debt in both the way the neoclassicals think about it, which is loanable funds, and the way post-Keynesians do, which is endogenous money, and see what happens. So consider a three-sector model. You've got S1, S2, S3. And I show expenditure which is not debt finance as EXY, where X is expenditure, that is percentage by sector X on the output of sector Y. So I can make up a table to show those relations between three sectors. And I'm going to consider where there's no borrowing possible at all. You might call that Say's law, but it's actually the inverse of Say's law. Or borrowing from other sectors is possible, which is loanable funds. Or borrowing from a bank, which is endogenous money. And let's take a look. This is demand creates its own supply, by the way, rather than supply creates its own demand. So here we have a table, and I've got the three sectors. Net income is the sum of the columns. Expenditure is the horizontal. Okay, so expenditure of sector 1 on sector 1, you don't look at that, we look at sector 1 on sectors 2 and sector 3. So the minuses here are the expenditure and the positives are the income. So the negative sum of the diagonals is therefore aggregate demand. And the sum of the off-diagonal elements is aggregate income. Okay? And they're necessarily going to be equal. Now, when you do the adding up, this is what you find. It's aggregate demand under the Say's law situation, aggregate income under the Say's law situation, one equals the other. Now I'm going to look at loanable funds, where sector 1 borrows from sector 2. So they're going to borrow delta D from sector 1 borrows delta D from sector 2, and that increases the potential spending by sector 1. But of course it reduces sector 2's potential spending by exactly the same amount. And I then have sector 1 spending more on sector 2 and sector 3, using alpha and 1 minus alpha of that delta D, and sector 2's spending falling by beta on 1 minus beta on sector 1 and sector 3. So this is now the pattern, including a change in debt where it's financed under the loanable funds idea of one non-bank agent lending to another non-bank agent. And when you then do the mathematics on that, yes, if you don't do cancellations, you get this nice yucky looking thing here, where delta debt is turning up as part of the argument, but when you then do the cancellations, what do you get? The terms in delta D cancel. So you're back to the same situation. If loanable funds were true, the neoclassicals are quite right, quite logically justified in saying change in debt plays no substantial role. There'd be a change in terms of how behaviour might shift between the two agents, but that's about it. So they're correct logically. They're wrong institutionally. Now endogenous money. The borrower's funds are coming from a bank. So the bank increases its assets by delta D, there's an identical increase in its liabilities, which is now money in the hands of Sector 1, and that delta D is then spent on the outputs of Sectors 2 and 3. So here's your equation there, or your table. It only differs by no minus delta D on the second row to the loanable funds. And when you work it out, there's the full expression, and the terms in delta D no longer cancel. When you get the reduced form, you find aggregate demand is change in debt plus expenditure financed out of existing money. And so is aggregate income. So both aggregate expenditure and aggregate income, a non-debt financed expenditure, which is the turnover of the existing stock of money, plus the change in debt. Turns up in both of them. Now that was not a surprise to me. It was nice to get that resolution. It also generalised to a flow of new debt. So if you have rather than just a one-off change now, you're looking at a flow of new debt, a flow of new lending coming in from the banking sector, then you can expand the expenditure financed out of existing money by velocity, and I'm bringing velocity back into argument about macroeconomics again, plus the change in debt, plus also net gross financial transactions. We're talking aggregate income, that's income of the lenders and the borrowers. Okay, so both those terms, that was a surprise to me. I didn't expect that, I must admit. The same sign for revenue for depositors and the revenue on loans. And when I look at the change in aggregate demand, I got an acceleration term turning up. So I've been arguing for a long time that acceleration of debt is a major factor in the change of demand, and now I got the mathematics behind it. So I got a different conclusion to what I expected. Certainly the most strongest one for me, which I was surprised, was these two having the same sign. That I didn't expect. It took me a while to understand it. I had to accept it because it's a mathematical conclusion. And it provides a causal explanation for that correlation. And particularly, and this depends upon the circumstances, the larger the level of debt, the larger those terms are going to be. So it really applies more to post-1970s data than beforehand. But it also ends up with a different conclusion about rejecting the role of change in debt in aggregate demand. And I hope it does transform how post-Keynesians think about the role of debt in aggregate, in demand and in aggregate income. So that explains this ridiculous correlation. This is taking a look at the correlation of the acceleration in private debt and change in unemployment in America over the last 25 years. That's minus 0.89. Again, not to be ignored, but it's still ignored by neoclassicals on a priori grounds. And what are their a priori grounds for ignoring it? Well, it's the loanable funds issue, and this is where I had a good old fight with Paul Krugman, and I imagine some of you have seen that. And his argument is that banks, and they just don't matter. You don't need to include banks in macroeconomics, and most of the time you don't need to include debt either, and you can ignore money. Okay, this is the thing which people who don't study economics actually don't realise. They're shocked when I tell them. They think economists are experts on money. Mm-hmm. I say, no, they're experts in finding reasons not to consider money. Okay. But here's Krugman saying, self-proclaimed Minskyites, which obviously is me, and many others, view banks that are somehow outside the rules that apply to the rest, and he says, I don't see it that way. Banks don't create demand out of thin air any more than anyone does by choosing to spend more. In other words, he's making an equivalence between banks lending money and individuals lending money to each other. And he says he'll get the claim that he doesn't understand it, he reckons he does, and it's the mystics who have it wrong. Now, in my opinion, he and the neoclassical school in general are barter mystics. They imagine you can model capitalism without banks, debt and money. And to me, that's like trying to model birds without wings. Mm-hmm. Good luck. So again, another statement from him, from his Endless Depression Now. He said, when debt's rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money, which I think is precisely wrong in endogenous money terms. It's a case of less patient people borrowing from more patient people. Now, I've given up on arguing with these guys, but it's fun to take their arguments and put it in a mathematical form and show who's right by just changing the structure. So what I've done is build a model in my software package Minsky, which is a rendition of the loanable funds model of banking you can find in the appendix to Eggertson and Krugman's paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. I've got a very stylised banking model at the end of that particular appendix. And I can show that they're right. if that's the actual structure of lending, if patient agents lend to inpatient agents, then you can forget about banks' debt and money. They don't matter except during a liquidity crisis. And change of debt do have minor impacts, but just by changing the velocity of circulation. Then I can just alter the structure of that model from loanable funds to endogenous money in roughly 30 seconds. You can time me if you like, let's see how long it takes, and see what happens when you look at a world where the banks are the ones doing the lending rather than patient agents and inpatient agents. So in the appendix, what he has is a consumer goods producing agent lending to investor goods producing agent, charging interest for the loan, and then the bank has arranged the loans so the bank gets an intermediation fee. That's the basic structure of the banking model in that particular paper. So I've set that up in Minsky, and it looks like this is a balance sheet. I've got a bit more detail in the actual model, which I'll show you in a moment. But there's lending from the consumer agent to the investment agent, and that's the flow of lending from positive to minus. The convention there is, I'm using in Minsky, and it's also very common, similar to the convention used in accounting, is that assets are shown as a positive and liabilities and equities are negative. So the flow, and the flows always go from plus to minus. Now that can be changed across to debit and credit for those who've done accounting, exactly the same concept. So that's the flow of lending there. Notice debt doesn't turn up because this is the bank's point of view, and the bank doesn't actually own the debt in this model. So debt has to turn up in another table. And that's the one for the consumer sector and also the investment sector, because the debt is an asset of the consumer sector and a liability of the investing sector. So there's the debt turning up as a positive asset, as you can see, of the consumer sector. And lending reduces the consumer sector's cash, but increases the asset they've got in terms of a loan. So there's lending reducing the amount of money they've got in the bank account, but it increases the amount of assets they've got which are earning money by having been lent to the investment sector, and it's got to do with that cash for the duration of the loan. Now when you simulate the model, and I'll bring it up now, oh dear, I didn't, I thought I'd set that up to be automatically started with the first mistake in my presentation. Let's see if I can find the file itself. Pardon me. So this is the Minsky model. Minsky is a beta software. We're still revising it. There's a particular bug in this version where we can resize the size of these tables that show banks, but unfortunately it's not stored when you save it. So it's got to produce the size here. So you can actually see what I'm doing. Let's go back to 0 again. And this is where I'd like to have a larger screen, but you've got to live with what you've got. So if I simulate this model, I'll just bring up, let's see, what's a good graph to show here. Bring up a large graph of GDP. And then simulate the model and change the rate of lending. Now you can notice down the bottom here, you can see the red line is the amount of money in the system, the black line is the amount of debt. If I change this number, this is saying it takes 7 years to change, to double the amount of lending. If I make it 5, there's an increase in the level of debt compared to money, as you can see. If I take people from halving their level of debt in 9 years to halving it in 30 years, there's another dramatic increase in the amount of debt. I'll just, so I can just pause that and move it down so you can see the graph a bit better. So you can see a dramatic change in the stock of debt compared to the amount of money. Keep on simulating and go back to the original situation. Let's have a total collapse in lending, pardon me, very slow lending, then back to the original situation, and then increase in repayment rates and then decrease back to the original situation. Lots and lots of changes in the ratio of debt to money. Looking at what's happening in GDP, almost nothing. The simulation has now been running for 1,260 years, okay, and we're still looking at a GDP rate of roughly 200. So I've made huge changes to the rate of lending and had bugger all impact on the macroeconomy. So if they were correct, it would mean you can ignore banks, debt and money in modelling capitalism. But here's going to be a really mystical thought. What if it's banks that do the lending rather than the consumer sector? Well, bring up the consumer sector table here. And notice I've got debt there as an asset of the consumer sector. Well, it's not. It's an asset of the bank. So I'm going to delete that column, and I'm going to delete all the financial operations that in fact go to the bank instead, and come back. I've got a couple of things I should fix up a bit more accurately, but that'll do as a start. And then come over here and add additional asset into the banking sectors table. The program remembers the debt is still there, so it brings the operations across for me. And all I have to do now is say, well, these payments here go to the banking sector rather than going to the consumer sector. And I'll delete this now superfluous bank fee. And if I had, if I delete, say rather than the amount of lending depending on how much is in the consumer sector's account, it's actually related to the level of debt. Just to change that, stop the whole system and simulate again. And let's just move down a bit. One shouldn't do these things live, you know it can go. No, there we go, it's working. Notice the red line's rising. The amount of money in the economy is growing because of the lending. If I now have an increase in the rate of lending and a decrease in the rate of repayment, then notice the red line's rising a bit faster again. If I then have repayment happening much more rapidly and lending much more slowly, then down we go with the amount of money in the economy. I now restore the original situation. And let's check and see what's happened to that GDP figure. And we've had a boom and a slump. Okay. So a simple piece of realism, and I hope I've trashed loanable funds. I don't need to do it for this room, obviously. But that's how simple it is to illustrate the difference between the two when you have a mathematical tool that can let you do it. Otherwise, you run around in circles talking to Paul Krugman. And I'd rather do other things than I'm running around in circles. So that's the outcome. Change in debt matters. The banking sector matters, money matters, debt matters. It should be a no-brainer to solve that. Of course, the no-brainer part is getting them to actually look at a simulation like this and saying, oh dear, we didn't realise that. But of course they won't do it. So the banking mystics, as Krugman calls them, are right. A change in debt has a dramatic effect on the macroeconomy. And what's actually going on mathematically is that loanable funds is what's called a conservative system. Not that it's right-wing, it just conserves something. It doesn't change the amount of money. It distributes where the money is, but it doesn't change the amount of money in existence. Whereas endogenous money is what's called a dissipative dynamic system. It doesn't mean that something's being dissipated, it means that nothing remaining constant. There's no given quantity that isn't altered by the dynamics. So money is created by an increase in debt and destroyed by debt repayment. And we can spend the rest of our lives running around in circles arguing this verbally, or we can show it in the mathematical model. And I think the mathematical model wins as a way of, I don't argue to those who believe otherwise. So if they behaved like mathematicians, then we'd get rid of this particular dispute. But of course they don't. They'll continue ignoring it. But what if mathematics actually was a mathematical discipline? What would it look like? Well, I think I could say that it would be complex systems analysis, which could be described as a modelling of social realities and emergent phenomena of human interaction, not all interatomistic, highly transient, reproduced and transformed through practice, the process of cumulative causation, aware that social reality is causal and processual, prioritising the goal of being realistic, fashioning methods in the light of that ontological understanding, and recognising the limits of a taxonomic science, in other words, consistent with Lawson 2013. And there are mathematical tools for open systems. Okay? They do exist, they've been commonplace in sciences for the last 40 or 50 years, rather than the reductionist atomistic nonsense that neoclassicals are still hanging on to. And the start was back in 1899. Poincaré did the proof that there was no solution to the three-body problem. That was the beginnings of our technical awareness of chaos and complexity. It began with Lorenz's demonstration of deterministic non-periodic flow. And his focus as a weather modeller was saying that we're invalid to use linear models and pattern matching. They can't do that. It just doesn't work because most of the energy comes out of nonlinear interactions in the weather system. And he says in dissipative systems, which is why I made the comment earlier about dissipative versus conservative, governed by finite sets of linear equations, constant forcing leads to constant response. He said, but that's not, so non-periodic flow, if you have a linear perspective, looks like something that must be a result of something coming in from the outside. But he said that is not applicable at all when you've got a non-linear system. And his was the classic example of chaotic and complex systems. So you have a simple model that has just 3 variables in continuous time and 3 parameters, 3 scalar parameters. It generates 3 equilibria, all of which for realistic values are unstable. And you can't model that as a system, a sequence of equilibrium states, because it's never in equilibrium. So this is, in fact, Lorenz's model in equilibrium, which I think is an extremely exciting thing. Okay. The XY plot at the top shows the XY variables plotted against each other. The 2 bottom ones show the variable over time. Exciting, isn't it? This is the same model. Let's bring it up. I hope I've got this one set up properly. Oh, I haven't. Bloody hell. Okay. You always stuff up some presentation. Here's Lorenz's model. I'll just simulate it live. So if I simulate this without a shock, what you see is equilibrium. Okay, starting off with the 0 equilibrium. If we start just tiny fraction away from the equilibrium for the first step, and then get rid of the shock and run it on, this is what happens. As I said, there are 3 equilibria in the system. There's a 0, 0, 0 equilibria, and 2 involving the positive and negative square roots of a quadratic plus one more constant. And you can see that the system started near 1 equilibrium. Rather than moving away and returning back to it after a shock, which is the usual neoclassical thinking, it blasts off out of the system. It doesn't blast off to infinity, and then it starts to cycle around the other 2 equilibria and through the third, or past the third. And if I ran this demonstration for 1,000,000 years, it would still be nowhere, it would never reach the equilibrium values. The system is inherently non-equilibrium. And that's commonplace in the real sciences today. So that's the system, just 0.1 from the x equilibrium, the other 2 values in equilibrium. And this is consistent with what you'll find in physics, but really being brought together by a classic paper by a true Nobel laureate, Philip Anderson, and he criticised what I could call applied reductionism. A wonderful paper called More is Different. Extremely, if you haven't read it, it's very much worth a read. And he said the main hypothesis in reductionism is that reductionism doesn't imply constructionism. He said the fact that you can, if you can reduce everything to simple fundamental laws, that doesn't mean you construct the universe from those laws. And it breaks down completely when you reach the combinations of both scale and complexity. And of course the economy is a classic instance of both scale and complexity. And he said the behaviour of large and complex aggregates of elementary particles is not to be understood in a simple extrapolation of the properties of a few of those particles. But that really again characterises how neoclassicals think. And what that means is, a simple way of putting it, when you do a hierarchy of the sciences, yes, biology, psychology needs biological organisms, but psychology is not applied biology. And yes, you need chemistry to be alive biologically, but biology is not applied chemistry. If it were, a typical biology exam question would be, please take these chemicals and create life. Okay? Biologists are sensible enough to know that's not a very good question, or rather it's too good a question. But economists believe they can construct macro out of micro. So you get entire new levels applying. It's an argument against the reductionism which still dominates neoclassical thought. So the whole is not only more than, but very different from the sum of the parts. And one intriguing thing I find about this paper is it has a curious finale. I reread it before I gave the presentation here, and it hadn't stuck in my mind before. This is wonderful. In the closing, he offers 2 examples from economics. Who does he choose? One, Karl Marx, to begin with, saying that Marx said quantitative differences become qualitative ones. Okay? But he said a dialogue in Paris in the 1920s sums it up even more clearly. Fitzgerald says the rich are different from us. And Hemingway says, yes, they have more money. So maths and economics should start from complex systems. Not the end of it by any means, and it's not the complete domain either, because there's things you can't do in mathematics. There's more modesty amongst mathematics than amongst any economists. That starts from nonlinear systems, from non-equilibrium, and also monetary systems as well. So I'm going to show now another case. Let's apply this complex systems thinking to Minsky's model of financial instability, which is the main area that I've been researching for the last 20 or so years. And Minsky did flirt with mathematics in his PhD and a bit of Koleski later, but he pretty much did the whole thing verbally. And I think what I've done is put those verbal differential equations into mathematical form. So his instability hypothesis starts from this proposition. It's necessary to have a theory which makes Great Depressions one of the possible states of our economy. And he had a time and debt-aware model with an economy in historical time, where there'd been a debt-induced recession in the recent past, and therefore both firms and were the main borrowers in his model, and banks were conservative about the debt-to-equity ratio, and therefore only conservative projects got funded. But because the economy has got to the recovery stage, most of those projects succeed, so firms and banks both revise their risk premiums and accept a higher level of debt to equity and start valuing assets more highly. And then you get to what he called the euphoric economy, where having a period of tranquil experiences in the economy causes rising expectations. So he said stability or tranquility in a world with a cyclical past and capitalist financial institutions is destabilising. Again, ultimately non-equilibrium thought. So you have self-fulfilling expectations. A decline in risk aversion causes higher investment. That causes the economy to grow faster. You have rising asset prices, making speculation on assets profitable. There's an increased willingness to lend money, which causes an expansion in the money supply and an expansion in demand, as I've argued earlier. And you get Ponzi financiers turning up, whose cash flow is less than their debt servicing costs. They profit by selling assets on a rising market, but they're incredibly fragile because they can't roll over their debt, their history, and so is the boom. So that's the verbal model, and then you get ultimately rising rates can make more conservative projects speculative. You get non-Ponzi investors being forced to sell assets to service debts. The market gets flooded with new entrants. That trend of rising asset prices declines, and of course you have loss-making enterprises accumulating losses all the way through who can fall over when they can't make a debt repayment. And the Ponzi's are the first to go when the whole thing collapses because they can't sell for a profit anymore, and they've got debt servicing costs that exceeds the cash flow they're getting from their businesses. You get an asset price collapse, increasing ratio of debt to equity, expansion of the money supply goes into reverse, investment evaporates, you enter a debt-reduced recession, which is where you started. Okay? So it's a cyclical verbal model, and it's one of the great models in verbal economics. I think the other great model is Schumpeter for explaining cyclical models in a model without a wipeout crisis like the financial crisis that Minsky describes. So modelling Minsky, I start from this proposition. So the natural starting point for analysing the relation between debt and income, notice he's also on about debt and income, is to take an economy with a cyclical past that is now doing well. Well, I took Goodwin's model of cyclical growth and I added debt finance to it. And that's a very simple model, saying the level of capital, roughly speaking, level of matter machinery, again, this is a measurement issue, which needs to be fixed up, and I'm working at a level of a corn economy, effectively, determines output. Output determines employment. Employment determines the rate of change of wages. Output minus wages and interest payments determines profit. Profit determines desired investment, and the gap between desired investment and profits determines the rate of change of debt. And investment is the rate of change of capital. And that's verbally stating the whole mathematical model. And the intriguing thing to me is, many things. First of all, could I capture what Minsky was talking about, which I did. But secondly, did the model tell me anything that Minsky didn't tell me? And this is the thing which I found quite remarkable. And the more I look back on it, the more remarkable I find it, because there were two features I didn't expect in the model and that Minsky didn't talk about. And they were, I'll bring up the model in a moment and show it. First of all, that there was falling volatility before there was rising volatility. Okay? The cycles in employment and the GDP declined for a while. In other words, you went through a great moderation. Mm-hmm. And there was a falling wages share, which in this model is a proxy for the rate of inflation. Again, what we saw happening in that period that neoclassical economists patted themselves on the back for. But what actually happened ultimately, and again, I haven't set this up to run properly, my mistake. I'll bring that later in conversation during the discussion, if you like. But those are two features that the model gave me that you could not find in Minsky's verbal logic. So I developed the paper before the neoclassicals, double S there. I invented the Great Moderation, and it motivated me to write a rhetorical flourish at the end of my paper in 1995. And I said, from the perspective of economic theory and policy, this vision of a capitalist economy with finance requires us to go well beyond that habit of mind which Keynes describes so well, the reliance upon a stable recent past as a guide to the future. This is the rhetorical bit. The chaotic dynamics explored in this paper should warn us against accepting a period of relative tranquility in the capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. I thought that was a nice way to finish a paper. I didn't expect it to become reality. Now, Bernanke, on the other hand, 2004, talking about this, looking backwards at this period of so-called great moderation, patted himself on the back for saying that it was better control of inflation, courtesy of monetary policy by central banks, that has contributed to this welcome change in the economy. Well, so much for that. That's what they saw, falling volatility, but of course what then happened was that rising volatility. And of course what they were ignoring was the level of private debt. When you look at the level of private debt, which they say should have no significant macroeconomic impacts, that's what they missed, this rising ratio of private debt to GDP, which is driving the whole process. So that's a simple model that made predictions that turned out to be correct. And part of the problem is that a verbal model simply can't follow all the feedbacks that exist in a complex system. And therefore I see the type of mathematics I'm doing here, and that people like Carl Chiarella do far better than I do, as qualitative mathematical analysis. You're not trying to get quantitative predictions necessarily, you're trying to qualitatively describe a system using mathematical tools. So you're not after this ridiculous attempt to forecast the future accurately, but you're trying to describe the qualitative behaviour of the economy accurately, and out of that get some sort of guide to what might happen in the future. So I see it as putting the verbal differential equations of the great non-equilibrium economists, of whom I see Minsky and Schumpeter and Marx as the major ones, into mathematical form. And of course ontological issues still abound because we're modelling human behaviour, and of course Hayek will tell me that I can't model human agency. Yeah, but also I'll remember Marx on this point and say that men make their own history, but not as they please. They make it under circumstances forced upon them, already existed and given and transmitted from the past. And partly what you're modelling in this complex system is those the dynamics of those structural effects of the existing economy. Now, that's a case for mathematics. What about those who say no matter what? Well, I think in some ways we ought to really see our status in life. We tend to be rather too caught up in our own obsessions and talk about our importance from the point of view of economists alone. But ultimately, what are we for politicians and for most of the public? We read chicken entrails. We're the alternative to the soothsayers and the witch doctors of the past, because we provide numbers, soothsaying numbers that politicians can read out in front of press conferences, predictions about the future. And if we don't do it, the neoclassicals will keep on doing it. Ontologically false, whatever else, but they'll keep on doing it. So we'll lose the academic battle because we concede the biggest practical function, I'll put that in inverted commas for good reason, but the biggest practical function we concede to the neoclassicals. Now, I'd rather see us become the weathermen of economics, in the sense that everybody wants good weather, especially in England, okay? But nobody expects a meteorologist to forecast good weather after a storm. You know it's going to get bad again. People inherently accept the weather is cyclical. This wonderful weather I've been enjoying in London for the first 4 months of my time over here, I know it's not going to last. I'm going to enjoy it while it does. So we need to achieve the same sort of realism for economics and the same acceptance that the economy is cyclical, prone to crashes, booms and slumps. And we won't get that for economics if we cede control of mathematics and abuse of mathematics to neoclassicals. We'll always remain a protest group when I think what we should endeavour to become is the mainstream. I'm not willing just to remain protesting about the neoclassicals. I want to eliminate that interesting but dated theory of economics. So I really see economics as an anti-mathematical discipline. It's mythematics, as I said earlier, not mathematics. That's the real problem in economics. And my opinion of mathematical economics is rather like Gandhi's supposed opinion of Western civilization, that it'd be a good idea. Thank you.